Greetings, friends! Juan Ingruski here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine War update for the week of May 26th through May 31st of 2025. And if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, and share this video around. And this week we have a ton of updates along the entire front. But before we begin, usually in these videos I tend to talk about the tactical advances on the ground, about their operational, strategic objectives, their implications. I tend to not really talk about other things like the diplomatic front, things like that, only if there need to, or like the missile strike campaign. Sometimes I do, but there was a big event that's actually that just happened yesterday, even today actually. But in any case, there was a huge, massive Ukrainian drone attack on the Russian strategic aviation fleet in Murmansk up here, the air base that's up here, and then also in Irkutsk. And we have the Ukrainians did some sort of drone attack that did basically like. And it wasn't like they launched it from Ukraine. We actually have proof that it was launched from trucks deep inside Russia. So Ukraine does have saboteurs within Russia that could launch drones. This is why they're able to attack Murmansk and everything. And it's good. The Russians probably didn't think they'd be able to attack this, so that's probably why they were caught off guard. But anyway, a ton of strategic Russian aviation was knocked out. Right now, the confirmed number I think is about 7. Which is a lot because these don't get built and they are very hard to replace. According to an analysis, they said about 10% of the Russian strategic aviation was knocked out by this blow. So this is not like Russia was completely demolished in their air, but this was definitely a bloody nose. Especially since they can't replace them unless Russia actually, does something, I don't know, crazy like starts doing industrial mobilization. But in any case, this was a very big bloody nose to Russia. And along with this, the Ukrainians did a bunch of terrorist attacks, destroying a bunch of civilian trains in the Bryansk region, and I think in Kursk. But the main one, which caused a bunch of casualties, it was in Bryansk, which I think is around this area here. So the Ukrainians did a massive attack to, I think they call it Operation Web, which is kind of a gay name. I don't know why they named it that. But in any case, this is something you Russians. This was a very big embarrassment for the Russians, and we'll see how that. This was a very big blow to them, but we shall see how they respond. Sometimes people are wondering, why is the power still on in Ukraine? Why are the Dnieper bridges still alive? Why has any of the top officials in Budanov of the SBU have not been targeted? Why are the Ukrainian generals not targeted? Why is Russia not actually hitting Ukraine where it hurts? Because, this was definitely bananas. They should have, the fleet should have been inside hardened bunkers. They've been, according, the Ukrainians launched attacks against other Russian air bases, which were repelled because they were closer to the front line. So it looks like, Russia, this is an entire war, and Russia needs to protect all their bases, not just the ones closer to the front. So, this isn't like a complete, this definitely is a embarrassment for the Russians, but it's not war ending for sure. But the big question is not that it happened, which is also bananas, but also what is the Russian response going to be? Are the Russians going to continue allowing the Ukrainians to have the lights on and to think that striking military targets are off limits unless they get attacked first? We might see maybe a factory blow up in Lvov or something, right? They're like, oh, quote me now, listen to me now, quote me later, whatever the fuck the saying is. But the Russians are going to attack Ukraine again with a massive missile strike. They're going to say they blew up some sort of military factory somewhere that produced drones. And the implication is that, we know this factory is producing drones, was, to kill Russian servicemen, to target Russian infrastructure and such. But we didn't attack it because we didn't want to, I guess, harm civilians that were working there or something. I don't know why, but the implication is that, oh, now that you attacked us with these drones, we'll attack you. Dude, you're at war. You could attack the factory whenever you want. You don't need a justification for it. Anyway, that is, at least in the pro-Russian sphere, that is the main concern for them, is that, why is Russia treating Ukraine with kid gloves? And obviously in the Ukraine sphere, they're very joyful that this knocked out a bunch of Russian strategic aviation. So definitely big banana moment. But we're waiting. There's going to be a response. Russia needs to do a response. But is it going to be the response as we're expecting, through a few shaheeds into some empty warehouses in Kiev, maybe, or something like that? or will they actually do something like, like maybe knocking out the rest of Ukraine power, like the 750 like substations that provide, electricity to the Ukrainian war effort? That is the question. So, in case. Yeah, so that is that, and we shall see what the Russian response will be. Anyway, let us now go to the what's happening on the ground, because that is what I usually talk about. Now, the first thing I'm going to talk about, we're going to talk about the Kostiantynivka direction, and that is correct. This entire area from Chasov Yar to around Shinchikov Pershi, around this area here, I call the Kostiantynivka direction. The reason for this is that this entire area is now converging to encircle Chasov Yar. You could see this happening on the big scope here, and this is one of the main Russian objectives. There's very different parts of this kind of direction. There's the Chasov Yar direction, the Tortesk direction, this kind of area, east of Minigrad, but they all converge to try to take Kostiantynivka. So I'm gonna talk about this entire area as the Kostiantynivka direction. So let's talk about more on this area, because this is where the Russians made their big breakthrough I talked about before. And this week, the Ukrainians actually sent a bunch of reserves here, which actually have slowed down the Russians. But with that being said, this did weaken them in the Sumy direction, which we'll talk about. The Russians made a lot of progress in the Sumy direction. But that being said, they still made a bunch of progress this week. So the biggest thing, as we said, the Russians are continuously expanding their positions from this area, and they have completely captured the village of Popa Yar, this little village right here. And not only that, the Russians have also captured the southern part of Poltavka. I don't think they've captured it completely yet, but there's a few of these high-rise building areas which might have to be taken out. But in any case, the Russians are in the southern part of Poltavka, taking this area right here. So I do think they have a position here, but they have not completely captured the village like they have in Popa Yar. But I do think the Russians will be able to fully secure this village. They've also taken a bunch of fields to the south of Rusin Yar, taken a bunch of these fields right here. So they're quickly approaching Rusin Yar. Again, the main goal here is to completely secure these 3 villages, and probably use these water reservoirs as a natural defense. Something like this. And but it does seem like the Russians will be able to do this, but it does seem like with the advent of Ukrainian reinforcements here that the Russians won't be able to maybe continuously do a breakthrough here, or maybe start advancing towards Volodymyrivka, Shiktovko, and Tortesk. They can advance, obviously, but it's not going to be this rapid advance like we saw last week from the positions on this highway up to here. So these 3 villages will probably fall to the Russians within a week or two, but then after that, the Russians will have to maybe hold here and then wait for their flanks to pull up. But yeah, so the battle for these 3 villages is now ongoing, and is a very decent sized. Having this would kind of put a wedge, at least in term, would put the Russians in a very good tactical positioning to start cutting off Kostiantynivka from the west, and such. So this is a very good breakthrough for the Russians here. And then a little bit more closer to the Minigrad direction is that the Russians have also completely captured the village of Shinchenko Pershi. We talked about how the Russians were expanding west from Novopoltavka last week, but this week they've continued advancing and took this village. This makes sense. After the fall of Malinivka 1 or 2 weeks ago, the Ukrainians, the Russians were able to pull up the flank here a little bit. Right now the Russians are also bound for Mirnia, and I do think that the next goal for the Russians are going to take Kopacheva and Mirnia and just expand it something like this, and just continue pushing westwards a little bit. This will also secure their flank here, so that when the Russians do start pushing towards these villages along these roads here, their southern flank will at least be secure. So yeah, so Shinchenko Pershi has fallen, and this is the fields that were taken this past week, which makes sense. It says Malinivka has fallen, and I do think that this will expand to something like this next week. So the Mirnia is now being battled over. Kopacheva will probably also be taken, but yeah, this will be the next goal for the Russians. But in any case, the Ukrainians are falling back towards their main position in the eastern part of Minigrad, namely the village of Kostiantynivka. This is a pretty decent-sized village. Along with this, they have a huge terracon, which is a local tactical height, and they have this substation right here, which is an industrial facility, which the Ukrainians could use as a defense. So, I think it's going to be very hard for the Russians to attack it directly. It's going to be very hard. So I do think, as I mentioned last video, the Russians are going to try to do an outflanking maneuver and try to, maybe reach, try to cut, this, try to reach, these areas right here and try to cut off the road more north. So that's a bit easier for the Russians to cut off Pokrovsk. But yeah, so that's kind of that kind of general western direction of the Konstantinivka direction, and also the Russians are improving their positions in this area. As you know, there's a bunch of trenches between Milyanivka and Yezhyetovka, like literally just a huge amount of trenches around this area. But this week we have geolocated confirmation of the Russians clearing a trench that was north of Yezhyetovka, which, you know, since they cleared it, they could actually fully secure this village. Again, it's not necessarily taking villages that matters. What matters is actually taking like tactical positioning, things that actually help you secure it. You know, Yezhyetovka is like one, you know, a village with a few houses, and they probably all got razed to the ground anyway. So it's very hard to actually, you know, secure yourselves there. But you know, taking like say a trench network would actually help you prevent any Ukrainians from being able to attack. But I do think with the Russian advance towards Myrnia, the Ukrainians will have to fall back from these systems back to this area where they also have a river to defend themselves. So I do think this kind of pocket here is going to close soon. Alrighty, a little bit more, and then another big thing that's happening in the Konstantinivka direction, in the more central part of it, is the collapse of the Zorya pocket. As we can see, this is the Zorya pocket. As you can see, last time there was this pocket that was forming in this area from Zorya down here. This entire area was a pocket because the Russians captured Alexandropol and Romanovka last 2 weeks ago, and they were able to start converging and creating a big pocket here. And this week, the pocket has collapsed. We have geolocated confirmation of the Russians raising their flags in the northern part of Zorya. Pro-Russian mapper said this area, these like kind of warehouses between Romanovka and Zorya have also been taken by the Russians, but this map does not show that yet. But we do have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in the northern part here, and I don't think they would have raised their flags if the Ukrainians were still on their flank here. But, you know, we don't have geolocated confirmation of the Russians raising their flags here, so, you know, it's definitely up in the air. But I do think these most pro-Russian sources say this has been taken. I don't think that's a stretch to say it has. But in any case, this entire area has collapsed. Zorya has been taken. Along with this, because of that, the villages of Star Mykolaievka and Ganovka have also been taken. So this entire area, if you remember, if you saw my last video, there was still a bunch of trench. There's a bunch of trench networks that were here, and that's because, you know, the front line was something, you know, like this, as you recall, before the start of the Russian summer offensive. About a month ago, and now, you know, so the Ukrainians built a bunch of trenches here, and now the Russians collapsed this entire area and pushed the Ukrainians all the way up north towards Alexandro, Kalinovo, Katerininovka, and so forth. So this entire area has been collapsed. So we saw the Russians, you know, raising their flags in Star Mykolaievka and Ganovka, Zorya, and so, you know, now the Russians have a flat line here, and now we'll see what the Russians will do. I do think, you know, they're, you know, now that the Ukrainians have fallen back to these string of villages to the south of this water reservoir here, so they now have their flanks more secure here, so they're able to, especially with the advent of Ukrainian reinforcements in this Konstantinivka direction, I do think they'll be able to hold on to this more longer. But I do think the Russians will start, you know, trying to collapse this area. I do think from Romanovka the Russians will advance here along this reservoir here, try to capture more of these fields here, try to reach Katerininovka. We see right here, and then another update here is that the Russians are continuously improving their positions from Novolinovka and have captured the western part of Yublodivka here, this kind of area right here. So, and, you know, some of these fields here. So the Russians are slowly moving along this reservoir. The Ukrainians have a bunch of trench networks to the north of this reservoir here. I think along this road here, right here, they have a bunch of trenches here. So, but there's a river that separates them. So, you know, the Ukrainians could try to, you know, prevent the Russians from attacking northwards, but, you know, the Russians don't necessarily have to attack northwards. They just have to take these villages to the south of this river here. This river, this Bochki River here. But in case, the Russians are going to be kind of doing like a claw tactic. As you can see, the Russians are going to keep advancing along this flank, and then they're going to advance from Romanovka along this flank towards Katerininovka. So, as you can see, they're going to start, you know, they're going to try to create the conditions to make another pocket here and force the Ukrainians to fall back behind this reservoir here, and then have the front line go something like this. And then from here, I think they're going to then focus on trying to collapse the Ukrainian positions that are still north of Tortesk here, namely Sherebrenka and Novospassky, which has been a giant thorn in Russian side here, you know, and everything. So it's a very big, how do you say it? You know, so I do think once they reach this area, they'll start trying to help mop up this area near Tortesk. But anyway, so that's kind of this area. The Zorya pocket has collapsed. The Russians have penetrated the Poltavka kind of tactical line here. Yeah. Now, in Tortesk itself here, remember, this used to be called the Tortesk direction, but, you know, it's not really, I guess that wasn't necessarily the best way of putting it, because the Tortesk direction is, how do you say, you know, it's not just about Tortesk anymore. There's a lot more to it, and it's not really battling for Tortesk. It's you know, they're now battling beyond it, so I do think Konstantinivka is a more appropriate thing. But around Tortesk itself, there has been some more progress, and specifically in this northern part here, near this area right here, where the Russians made a lot of rapid progress. We actually had geologic information that came out about a day ago of the Russians raising their flags in the central part of Delivka, this village right here. This was in the very center of the town right here, in this area right here. There's a lot of we didn't see the Russians raising their flags in the most northern part of this village, but I do think that area has been cleared by the Russians. I don't think the Russians would be out in the open raising their flags here if the entire village has not been fully secured. But in any case, this is a very big game. This is actually a very big breakthrough for the Russians here. There's a bunch of trenches here because the Ukrainians, the front line has been stabilized around this canal for a long while. And so, the breakthrough here has a very big potential, if the Russians continue pushing here to flatten the front here. And then obviously with the push from the Russians to take Katerinovo and Kivil and Balka, they could then, have the front line, stabilized here and then reach right up to the southern outskirts of Kostiantynivka. So that's the goal. The goal is to start pushing the Ukrainians away from like Tortesk and then start the battle for Kostiantynivka. That is the goal here. In any case, so yeah, that's what we're seeing at the moment. But yeah, so the breakthrough into Delivka, we also have geologic confirmation of the Russians being in this Delivka. It's kind of interesting. I think it's because of Ukrainian renaming things that caused this all to be kind of wonky and weird. But anyway, I do think this entire area has also been captured by the Russians. This area, this train station. We have geologic confirmation, because of this, that the Russians have taken these fields between Delivka and I guess Delivka. Yeah, so this entire area is now being pushed further and further up. I do think the Russians will continue pushing along this rail line here as well. And then I think there's like a river here. Yeah, so I think the Russians could probably try to maybe if they have positions here, they could then continue pushing towards Bilohora and then try to collapse this pocket that's between Bilohora and this area. And then so once the Russians could take something like this going on, because there's a bunch of rivers here and some positions that they could hold on to, the Russians will then also continue pushing north along this, this reservoir, continue taking more and more of these fields. And then from here, maybe what the Russians could do is hook up with the Russians that are in Chasov Yar and try to, take out everything between this line here. And then the main goal for the Russians here is to take the village of Alexander Shutina, which will be the main forward operating base for the Russians in advancing towards the southern part of Kostiantynivka. But I don't think they're going to advance into Kostiantynivka. I do think the Ukrainians built a bunch of trenches and defenses around Kostiantynivka this situation. I do think the Russians are going to start trying to put the squeeze on it in multiple directions instead of assaulting it directly. So, but, it is good to push the Ukrainians out of here. So, this pocket that's between Chasov Yar and Tortesk is now slowly but surely collapsing. It used to be completely untouched but now the Russians are slowly but surely pushing the Ukrainians out of here. And then also, Chasov Yar is being kind of, what used to be called the Chasov Yar direction. I am now calling this being part of the Kostiantynivka direction, just, because it's part of the same overall strategic outlook. And there's been actually a lot of major changes in the Chasov Yar part of the Kostiantynivka direction as well. The biggest thing is that we finally have, most mappers are saying this, that the Russians have completely captured the central part of Chasov Yar. Finally, after months of battles, the central Chasov Yar area has been completely liberated by the Russians. Now the thing is, the Russians have not raised their flags. So for a big victory like this, like taking the central part of Chasov Yar, I do think they would have raised some flags here. So it is a bit of a big question, like how tenuous is the Russian hold in central Chasov Yar? That is the big question. That is the big question. So like is it just like this is just a big gray zone? Is it like what's the exact what's the status here? So I do think we need a bit more. I think you should just put a bit of a small question mark on how secure the Russians are here. But it does show, most mappers are saying that central Chasov Yar has fallen. So I do think, that's definitely a big thing. I don't think that's obviously like out of the blue, like, oh, this is impossible. I do think it's definitely possible. But I do think it's something that, we should wait until we have GLK confirmation of it. We also have some, but if the central Chasov Yar has fallen, which is definitely something that's possible, the next thing the Russians have to do actually to fully secure Chasov Yar is these two micro districts. I think it's called the Shentenko micro district, which is this area right here. So as you can see, the Russians have already taken the most eastern part of this district, which is like just a bunch of like low-level residential areas. And then the next small, I forgot what they call this, but this is another micro district. This area right here, as you can see, I think this is a small little like area where there's high-rise buildings. So yeah, so this area. So there's these two micro districts. So in order to actually fully secure Chasov Yar, the Russians will have to take something like this, and then probably then link up with their forces in the northern part, in the northern residential areas, and capture this kind of this forest here. So if they want to say they fully control Chasov Yar, the Russians will have to take something like this. So yeah, there's a little bit more to take. The central part was definitely the hardest part, and then it's also at the tactical height. So as the Russians continue pushing towards Kostiantynivka, they're now in a downward projection. So that means they're now going to be on a downward slope here. So it's definitely a be a bit more easier, especially since you don't have to like go through from one high-rise building to another. So definitely a big breakthrough for the Russians here. So yeah, and then there's and that's really it for that Kostiantynivka direction. A lot happening in this direction, and this is probably one of the most interesting areas that's happening in the war so far. So yeah. Now let us go to the Pokrovsk direction, and there's actually not been much happening here. Actually, the Russians are still battling for Novosibirsk, Novomykolaiivka, but the Ukrainians are putting up fierce resistance to prevent the Russians from reaching the oblast. There's been no changes in the Pokrovsk area itself, and the only thing we have as a how do you say it? As confirmation is that the Russians have raised their flags in the most western part of Tortesk here, this village right here. So we do have confirmation that this village has been taken by the Russians, but the village of Gorogovka, which is the last Ukrainian village on the way to Dnipro Oblast, is still in probably full Ukrainian control, because the Russians have been bombing this village heavily, so that shows that Ukrainians are still here. This makes sense because the Ukrainians really want to prevent the Russians from breaking into Dnipro Oblast. But yeah, so Bogdanovka and Tortesk have been completely cleared by the Russians, so this gives them a more forward operating base. But again, the Ukrainians are putting up stiff resistance to prevent the Russians from reaching the Dnipro Oblast. But besides that, there's not been much in the Pokrovsk direction. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the South Donetsk direction, and this is actually where a lot of interesting things are happening, and this is also where the Russian command is a bit more truthful in a lot of areas, because whenever they say they took a village, they provide geolocated confirmation and flag racing, unlike other areas. So it does prove that this area, these people, the command in this area is at least honest. So that is a good thing. The biggest thing is that, as we talked about, how the Russians completely captured Ordania and Baratar last week, they are now improving their positions between Baratar and Ordania and the south of this river that's right here, the Vochka River. So this week we have confirmation the Russians have taken these fields between Baratar and Ordania. So yeah, the Russian, right now they're holding on here. The Ukrainians are trying to, have been doing completely suicidal attacks, because the Ukrainian command here, unlike the Russian command, is actually really embarrassed that they lost Baratar. So they're trying to say, no, we're still in control of it, but that's just leading Ukrainian troops to their deaths. We also have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being on the most eastern part of Alexeyevka, so it looks like they now finally have a foothold, at least in this area. The thing is, there's a bunch of trench networks that flow all the way up to the Dnipro Oblast, so there's a bunch of trench networks here. There's also a bunch of trench networks that are north of Andriivka, but definitely this is not just village hopping. There's a bunch of trenches in these fields here that prevent the Russians from fully securing, continuing pushing forward. But if they have at least positions in Alexeyevka, they could reinforce it and then slowly push the Ukrainians out here, especially with their gains in Baratar and Ordania. The Ukrainians are definitely in a much worse situation here, but they really want to hold on to Alexeyevka, because if this falls, then there's nothing else that really prevents the Russians from advancing. There's Zelensky Kut, Ukrainka, but as you can see, it's like a one-way straight village. There's not really much else defending the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians really want to hold on to this village. So I'm betting they're going to be holding on to this very hard, which they already have. And then a bit more here, we have geolocated confirmation the Russians are still in full control of Vasola, so that's definitely good. I wonder when the Russians will continue advancing towards Fedorivka here, just to cut off one of the roads, or at least reach the southern part of Komar, which is one of the main operational objectives of the Russians in this South Donetsk direction. But one of the most interesting things, one of the most biggest advances of the Russians in the South Donetsk direction is kind of more in the Velika Novoslovka area, where the Russians have completely captured the villages Leopolia and Novopil. Basically, once this past week started, the Russians started re-advancing from their positions along this area right here, and have completely captured everything here. So everything in this area has been captured in this past week. So very big gain for the Russians. The Russians have been raising their flags in Zelina Polia and Novopil. From this point, I don't know where the Russians will go. They probably will improve their positions a lot. Maybe they'll advance towards Timurivka here. I do think the Ukrainians are going to try to hold on to this for dear life, because if the Russians reach here, then they could reach the Dnieper Oblast from here. Technically, this village is in the Zaporizhzhia Oblast, so the Ukrainians definitely don't want the Russians to take this, so that they could then enter this area. So I do think this is definitely a logical part for the Russians to advance here. Maybe the Russians just will start advancing towards these fields here. Right now I don't really see where the Russians will. It could definitely be possible that the Russians just stop here. They're like, okay, we took 2 villages in the Donetsk Oblast. Definitely one of the main goals for the Russians to take the rest of Donbass. So taking these 2 villages, which are in Donetsk Oblast, is a good start. But tactically, right now they're in a bit of a pickle. Right now there's not really an area that right now the front is pretty solid here. There's not really a way that could exploit it. So the Russians will have to force their way here. Maybe they advance through these fields from Velinopolia and Zelenopolia in these fields here. The main goal for the Russians is Kostiantynivka, but the Ukrainians are holding on to this for dear life. But yeah. Anyway, and then in the Zaporizhzhia direction, there's been no changes. The only big interesting thing that happened is that the Ukrainians have said that the Russians have started an offensive in the Zaporizhzhia direction, but we have no indication of this. They did an offensive about 2 months ago, which took a few of these villages in the west here, but there's been no advancements here for like 2 or 3 weeks now. We do have geolocated confirmation that the Ukrainians are still holding on to southern Kupyansk, which is where the Russians have been bombing a lot, but I don't the Ukrainian command announced like a few days ago the Russians activated here, but I don't see anything like that. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Seversk direction, and let's talk about this. Only some small gains in the Seversk direction. We have geolocated confirmation of the Russians clearing some of these fields in the most western part of Verkhomainonska, so that does prove that Verkhomainonska is still fully under Russian control, and the reason for this is because, unlike past attempts, the Russians have actually captured most of these hills that are to the north of Verkhomainonska. I do think the Russians are going to try to take the rest of the fields here. Maybe they already have, and that's why they're able to hold on to this. But yeah, so something like, if the Russians could hold on to the tactical heights that are north of Verkhomainonska, they could hold on to this village. This village has been taken by the Russians. Along with this, in Ivano-Darivka, the Russians raised their flags here, which maybe they're just, we already know Ivano-Darivka was under Russian control, but, in any case, the Russians are also advancing towards this tree line, trying to take it, and I do think that the Russians are just trying to take, a bunch of these tactical heights to the north of Ivano-Darivka just to secure their positions here a bit more better. In any case, I do think, one of the main goals for the Russians is to probably just try to clear, these fields to the south of Verkhomainonska as well, just to secure this village a little bit more. Again, the main goal here is to take all these villages that are to the east of Seversk, just so they could start encircling Seversk. But right now the Russians are slowly but surely, step by step, doing that. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Lyman direction, and in the Lyman direction, there's actually been a lot of interesting things. This is not the one where this is where the Russians are now starting to make advancements, whereas before there's been almost no advancements. But in any case, it's not as spectacular as what's happening in Kostiantynivka or anything, but it is still very interesting. And one of the main prizes that the Russians have taken this week in the Lyman direction is the village of Retokogup here. This sounds like an ancient shaman ritual word or whatever, but we have geolocated confirmation of the Russians raising their flags here. This is another big gain for the Russians here. One of the biggest things is that this reaches one of the main reservoirs here, that's in the northern part here. And what this does is that the Russians could use this reservoir, with the capture of Retokogup and reaching this reservoir, is that they could then start moving southwards and start, using this reservoir as a shield as they reach towards the village of Shandor-Ledokovko here. And this would, if they could take this village, this would definitely hamper the northern part of Lyman very seriously. So the fall of Retokogup is a very big gain for the Russians. Along with this, the Russians could also advance northwards here. I do think maybe one thing the Russians are going to try to do is try to take Guluzhnikovka, Andriivka, Novomiriya, Olavka, just to, maybe take Girigivka. We do know that in the past few weeks, the Russians have been slowly but surely pushing from Novomykolaievka and Makivka. This week, I think they took these fields here. But anyway, some small progress, but in the past week, there's been a lot of progress along these fields trying to reach the village of Disccusion. The main reason for this is because it's part of Luhansk Oblast, and taking this would be a very big gain for the Russian PR purposes, just so they could say they have 100% control over Luhansk. But in any case, I do think the Russians will, maybe push something like this going on. Try to take something like this going on. So, like this. And then from here, we shall see what the Russians do. But I do think in this area, this is what the Russians will do. And then from here, the Russians will also push southwards. Most mappers are saying the Russians are out trying to encircle Zelina Dolona here. We talked about the Russians, took Lipovka to the west of Novi a few, 2 weeks ago, but this week most mappers are saying they're trying to take the field to the south of Zelina Dolinia. Man, that's a bit of a tongue twister. Maybe not that, but it's just hard to say. But in any case, I do think they will be able to take this village. It's not a big village at all, and I do think the Russians will be able to take it. And from here, then the Ukrainians will fall back to their next line of defense in Karpatagya, Serdodinina, Shendyrinovka, Lokovko here, and so forth. Anyway. And yeah, so that is a very big gain for the Russians. In Torskoye, it seems like the Russian command here is a bunch of retards. They said they fully took it, but they lied. I do think maybe the Russians are in northern part of Torskoye. I do think maybe, they would be satisfied if they kind of, this Torskoye bridgehead, which has been here since the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2022, if the Russians could, make this not a salient anymore and just kind of flatten here, that'd be good. But that means that the southern part of Torskoye is still under Ukrainian control. But we still need some more videos to see if the northern part of Torskoye is under Ukrainian control or under Russian control. So we should just wait for that. Alrighty, now let us go to the Kupyansk direction. And in the Kupyansk direction is actually something very interesting happening. So the biggest thing that's actually, the Russian Ministry of Defense said they have completely captured the village of Kindershivka, Radinovka, and so they've taken something like this. And then some sources are saying they also took this gas station, which is part of Kupyansk technically. So technically they have now actually entered Kupyansk itself. We don't have any GLK confirmation of this, and a lot of mappers are saying that this is false, that this is not actually true. The Russian Ministry of Defense reported it, but that doesn't mean that they didn't report it with Russians raising their flags here. It's something to report in this weekly update because it might be true. Maybe they just they can't raise their flags because it's maybe a lot more precarious situation there than and such, but. It definitely can be a case of, trying to prove that they're, it could be a false alarm here. But it is something to report. Now, if they have taken these two villages, it would be a very big gain for the Russians. This would allow them, this is a very big stepping stone in their Dorichnia bridgehead in the southern part to actually start encircling Kupyansk. I do think they need to take a few more villages in this area. Kinerdosky is definitely step one, but there's a bunch of other villages. They will probably push towards this rail line here. Try to take Malashepaki, Velika Shepaki, Man, these are hard as fuck names to pronounce. But, I do think if the Russians want to actually secure the northern foothold here, I do think they need to take something like this. If they can take something like this, then they'll have a very solid position in the northern part of Kupyansk to actually start advancing into Kupyansk itself here. But we don't even know if they actually have taken Kirodosky yet. So that is something to report, but we don't know if that's actually been happening. We shall wait and see. And a bit more north in the Dorichnia bridgehead is the Russians have actually activated here, and I always wonder why the Russians never did this, but they did this week, is that the Russians have completely taken the small little village of Stroivka here, and also the fields between it. So we talked about the Russians took Tolopolpli here, and because of the Russian advance into Strokla, this entire area kind of behind, what is this? Is this a rail line, or is this a road, or is this a tree line? It looks like it's like a road. But anyway, so this road here with a tree line, everything behind it, this area right here, has been taken by the Russians. So this week, everything that in this kind of red circle was taken by the Russians. So a good gain for the Russians. This definitely pushes them away from the lower ground near the river and towards more higher ground. So definitely secures Tolopilia a bit more better. We also have some GLK confirmation on the Russians being a bit more in these fields between, in this area right here. So looks like they're trying to encircle Kamyanka a little bit. They took the main village of Kamyanka, except Kamyanka is a bit more on the lower ground here. as compared to everything else. So I do think maybe what the goal for the Russians here is to, I don't know if the Russians, they just did this because it would be tactically useful, but, the Russians haven't really been pushing here for a while, but, maybe the Russians will then activate across the border, take Bolokivka here, and try to, like, maybe, push down here along this road, and, just slowly, like, keep making pockets here, and since there are, since this entire area is along the border, the Russians just have to keep attacking along the border and just keep like creating pockets here. So, if the Russians break through here, then everyone here will have to fall back to Ordania, right? And then suddenly all this would be taken. In any case, I drew that. Yes, I'm a child. But anyway, yeah, I'm a bit of a retard. Anyway, in any case. Yeah, and that is the Kupyansk direction. Anyway, in the Kharkov direction, nothing much. Most sources are saying the entire northern part of Kharkov has been taken. Most Russian mappers, again, Volchansk is split in half by the river. Most mappers are saying this has been taken. This map has been updated to show that this entire, at least the most western part, has been taken. But I do think that this entire, this northern part has been taken. I think I talked about this last week, but definitely something to keep in mind. But yeah, once northern Volchansk has been secured, I don't think the Russians will advance anymore, because then they'll have to cross the river, and that will complicate their logistics. And considering how hard it took to even take northern Volchansk, I don't think the Russians will risk it. Anyway, now we're going to go into the most interesting things that happened this week is in the Sumy direction, where the Russians are making rapid progress, and this is where the Russians are, because the Ukrainians pulled a bunch of reserve troops from this area, that they've made the Russians are able to advance rapidly here. So the most interesting thing is the Russians are making more progress in the most western part of Sumy here. So the biggest thing is that the Russians have, first thing at the beginning of this week is the Russians have completely captured the village of Volodymyrivka and Volodovka. This makes sense because, I've always wondered why, with the Russians advancing in Bilogovki and in Vasilovka, that, and such, I always wondered why they didn't, try to move along this kind of reservoir here to, expand their bridge here. Well, that's what they did. So they've captured these two villages here. So, these are border villages. But then, also, around the beginning of last week, the Russians have completely captured the village of Biladovko. We have geolocated confirmation of the Russians raising their flags on the most southern part of this town. So definitely this village has been completely secured. This is kind of like Basovka in the sense that this is one of the more bigger villages where the Russians could put their troops. So it's definitely a very big gain for the Russians here. But along with this, the Russian defensive has been expanding rapidly. And one of the biggest things is that more in this western direction as well, is that the Russians have also captured the village of Kostiantynivka, another border village. And along with this have entered the village of Kinderjurivka here. And if they capture this village, there's another big village that the Russians could use to as a forward operating base. That being said, we don't have any geolocated confirmation of these advances yet, so I would pause a little bit here. But most, even pro-Russian even like neutral sources, I should say, are acknowledge, and even pro-Ukrainian sources acknowledge the Russian advances in Sumy. In any case, but one of the biggest gains of the Russians is that the Russians have completely captured the village of Alexivka here. I'm still waiting for some more geolocated confirmation, but this is another kind of long village here that the Russians could use to supply their troops here. So the Russians are now activated fully in the Sumy direction. As you can see, multiple villages have been taken. If the Russians could fully secure Kinderjurivka and Alexivka, I think they'll also take the village of Andriivka and link up the two fronts here. Along with this, I do think the Russians will continue pushing from their position in this area to take Novomykolaievka, Verchachi, and Yelobudnovka here, like this. I think this is definitely, just to flatten the front here. And if they are able to do this, this would cut the main supply line that supplies the main Ukrainian logistics hub in northern Sumy, Yunatovka. So this is one of the main goals for the Russians. I think if the Russians could take Yunatovka, they'll definitely, this will be the forward operating base. From that point, it depends what the Russians do. Maybe they stop. Maybe this is all what the Sumy bridgehead amounts to, just a small, little bridgehead in the north here. But in any case, but, maybe they, I talked about last week how the Russians might try to make multiple incursions throughout Sumy Oblast in this area to start encircling Sumy. Who knows? But in any case, the Russian advancements here have been very rapid and very much big progress here. Along with this, the Russians have captured these fields between Lukovka and Biladovki here, and between Lukovka and the Russian border here. So this area right here. So a lot of big gains are happening for the Russians. Along with this, some sources are saying the Russians already have captured about 25% of Yunatovka, at least the northern part. The northern part is just some small residential buildings, but in the center part of this village, I think there's some high-rise buildings that the Russians could use to defend themselves. Yunatovka, the Ukrainians are going to put up a hell of a fight for it, but if the Russians could take these villages that I mentioned before, they'll cut the main supply line supporting Yunatovka, and then suddenly, there'll be no more ways to supply Yunatovka, or at least it'll be very hard to. They'll have to move through these fields here. But yeah, so lots of rapid progress in the Sumy direction. I do think the Russians will be, if the main, right now I think the main goal for the Russians here is to create, just take something like this. This would create a small bridgehead here. From here, maybe the Russians push to try to take these villages that are to the north of this forest. But I do think the forest is going to slow down the Russians very much. I do think it's going to be very hard for the Russians to be able to advance through these forests into Sumy. So I do think that if the Russians don't stop where I indicated before, the Russians will definitely stop somewhere like right here. And then from here, I do think the Russians will then move, down here towards this highway to try to cut off one of the main roads supplying Sumy. That is to say, if they don't stop and just they don't want to take Sumy, they just want to make a small bridgehead. So we shall see. Alrighty, that is the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed my weekly Russian-Ukrainian war updates. Be sure, if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian war updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, and share this video around. So aim high and wander on.